Good evening, everyone, and I'd just like to say what a pleasure it is to be here again at the RI. The RI is one of my favourite places to come and talk, and I've been doing this for a number of years now. I actually wanted to show you a small snippet of a video that was taken a few years ago, and this was an unusual talk. I'll show you and then I'll explain afterwards.
As a Londoner, I don't often get a chance to see that, and so that also inspired me. But it wasn't just the stars that inspired me, it's also... Oops, sorry, she's taking over the talk. I knew she'd do this.
I'll leave it there. But that was a talk I gave a number of years ago, probably about 12 years ago. And that baby is actually with us tonight. So this is my daughter, Laurie. Now, in that talk, I was actually carrying you. I don't think I can do that anymore because you're now taller than me. But I'm looking forward to when you can carry me. So, so I think a round of applause for my daughter, please. Thank you, Sarah. So whenever I'm in front of a distinguished audience, and I can tell you're a distinguished audience, I do like to get my CV out there. And so this is me, sort of sums me up, sort of a Maggie Aderin, born in London, but my parents come from Nigeria. I went to school in the southeast of England mainly, but studied at Imperial College. Now, Imperial College for me was a place of magic and wonder, because as a child I used to go to the Science Museum and to the space section there. And so to go to Imperial College, to me that was always where the clever people went. So I was immensely honoured when I was admitted to Imperial, and I did my degree there and my PhD. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And since then, I've been working in many sort of different industries, but mainly I've been making instrumentation that sort of studies the universe. And I've done that for the MOD, in university systems, and also out in industry. Over the years, I've had a number of a lot of support for actually doing science communication. And I set up my own company, Science Innovation Limited, about 20 years ago. It's actually 20 years ago this month. I can't believe where the time's gone. And in that time, I've spoken to over 550,000 people. And I must admit, I'm knackered. But it has been an absolute joy, and especially speaking to kids. And sometimes I bump into someone, and it's usually when I'm doing something embarrassing, like, "Oi, Laurie, what are you doing?" And so someone's like, "Hey, are you Maggie?" And I was like, "Yeah, why?" And they say, "Oh, you came to my school, and now I might be studying physics." And I think, "Oh my goodness." So yeah, it is a real privilege to be able to speak with you tonight. And so what do I do? I'm a space scientist, and I'll tell you about some of the work I've done, for instance, on the James Webb Space Telescope. I'm an author, which is slightly surprising, and I'll explain why that is in a few moments. But also, I work on TV, and I'm a science communicator. And as you'll see, this is quite a luxury for me, because I've got an hour to speak to you, but I will still go over. And I think I'll go over because I get very excited about everything that's out there. And so I have a tendency to say, "Oh, yes, and I'll just throw this in and throw this in." So yes, at some point, my daughter will wave at me and sort of cut me off. But until then, I will keep on speaking. So to give you a sort of a quick overview, the sort of things I get up to, I work on various television programmes, and these are just sort of some of the other ones I've got to work on. So I work on The Sky at Night, the longest running science show in the world. The person who did it before me was Patrick Moore, and he did it for 57 years. Now, I'm not going to make that unless there's amazing advances in medical science, but 57 years, and at that time, it was one episode a month when he did it, and he only missed one episode in that time, so quite a legend. So I do sort of highbrow documentaries about, so do we really need the moon? The answer is yes. And also sort of looking at satellites. But one of the things I also love doing is I do children's programmes. And so these are sort of two of the children's programmes I've been involved in, a CBB Stargazing, which is sort of a stargazing for sort of really small kids. So it's sort of average age of about 5 years old. And when we film it, we used to film it in a field in Derbyshire, and would wrap the kids up and give them hot water bottles and hot chocolate. And then I would say, look up at the night sky and tell me what you'd see if the clouds weren't there. Because it was always cloudy. And then also, Out of This World is, as you can see, that's my daughter Laurie, and we made that during lockdown in our kitchen using a very large green screen, and that was really good fun to make, and sort of celebrating sort of the universe again. Bizarrely, I also get to do comedy shows. And as a space scientist, I would have never thought that would be possible. But I used to work on a program called Ducks, Quacks, Don't Echo on Sky One. And also more recently, I literally just told you on Channel 4 with Jimmy Carr. Recently I was working on a new blockbuster from Netflix called, I don't know, has anyone here seen Three Body Problem? Yes. Actually, you might not realise, but there's a podcast to go with Three Body Problem. So I'm not in Three Body Problem, but we made a podcast to accompany the show. And with that, it was sort of mind-boggling. We were speaking to people about the Chinese Revolution. We were speaking to people about the probability of aliens coming to Earth and all sorts of amazing, other amazing things. And got to speak to the showrunners, so the people who actually made the show and the special effects. So that was definitely a very fun thing to do. And also, I got invited to a Netflix party. If you get invited to a Netflix party, go, because it was really good fun. And actually, I think you might be able to see, actually, if I'm going to try and use this, if you can say, this is Benedict Wong. And anyone who likes the Marvel Universe, he's in the Marvel Universe. And so to see him and be there, and it turns out he's a really good DJ as well, so it was a great night. As well as that, I get to do things which I would have never thought possible. And I think this is one of the messages I want to get, and this is why the title of my talk is Reaching for the Stars. This is actually a film called Last Swim, which was premiered recently at the British National Film Institute. And I went along, and I had a cameo in the film. And I was sitting there with the audience saying, that's me. And so, yes, when you reach for the stars, you'll be amazed by what happens and what amazing things happen on the way. So I always say to people, think big and think crazy. So as well as sort of doing things on television, I also write books as well. And I love it because I like children's books. And that's one of my favourite things to do. And these are sort of two of the children's books I wrote. Dr. Maggie's Grand Tour of the Solar System is a thought experiment. So Albert Einstein used to do thought experiments. Imagine what it would be like to travel out there on a beam of light. And this is sort of travelling through our solar system as a thought experiment. And then the second book is Am I Made of Stardust? And this was a book based on the questions that kids had asked me over the years. So I've been out there sort of speaking to kids for 20 years, many fantastic questions, and this book is a sort of a celebration of those questions. As I'm a self-certified lunatic, I've also written books about the moon, and this is my love letter to the moon, because as I am a lunatic, it was just celebrating the glory that is our local companion, the moon. And it's looking back in time and seeing how different cultures have celebrated the moon. It's looking at the science of the moon, but also the future of the moon. Because at the moment, we've got the Artemis program looking to send people back to the moon. So it's an incredibly exciting time. And yes, I'll tell you a bit more about that. Stargazing. I was brought up actually here in London. I was brought up in Camden. And in London, often with the light pollution, you don't get to see much, but you can often see the moon. And yes, even then you can do some stargazing. So that's celebrating stargazing. And my two latest books, The Story of the Solar System and Webb's Universe, which I'm going to talk about tonight. So yes, that is my portfolio. And just to show, I get to meet some really amazing people. This is actually me with my daughter, amazing person, but also Tom Hanks. And Tom Hanks is holding a copy of my moon book, because it turns out he's a lunatic too. So yes. But one of the things I was exploring in the moon book, and one of the things I want to explore tonight, is how our knowledge of the universe has changed. And this is one of the things I love to speak to kids about. Because we sort of, sometimes with science and with subjects like this, we sort of speak about as if we know everything. We've pretty much got it sussed. And it's so untrue. And in this, I'd like to explore how our knowledge of the universe has evolved over time. And so to do this, I'm looking at the history of our solar system and beyond. And so if we go back in time, we can look at the ancients and what they believed. And one of the things that I'm fascinated by is that every culture across the world has looked up at the night sky and wondered. They've all been sort of in awe of it. But when you look at the ancients, what they used to believe is that the Earth was the centre of everything. And it sort of made sense, because you could see the sun rise, you could see the sun set. It felt as if Earth was a centre of everything. If you look up at the night sky, especially in the northern hemisphere, we have the pole star, and then all the stars wheeling around the pole star. So again, it felt as if we're at the centre of everything. And so that's what people believed. And Aristotle also supported this idea of the Earth being the centre of everything. But then when you looked up in the night sky, there were some things which were misbehaving, let's put it that way. People used to call them wandering stars. And this is a time-lapse photograph of them. And so if you see here, what you have is, this is a planet, probably Venus actually. And what you can see is it goes forward in the night sky, it goes backwards in the night sky, and then it goes forward. So this is a time-lapse photo taking over a sort of a number of months. And yet these were sort of the wandering stars. And people say, what are they? We don't know. They're the wandering stars. We don't talk about those. But then people came along and said, oh, hold it, let's have a closer look at these wandering stars. And people like Copernicus came up with the idea that the Earth isn't the centre of everything. The sun is the centre, this heliocentric sort of view of the solar system. And so if the sun is at the centre, then what those wandering stars are, they are fellow planets. So Earth is a planet, and these wandering stars are planets also going around the sun. And that's why they seem to move forward and backwards in the night sky. So that seemed to make a lot of sense. But then, and this is actually one of Copernicus's diagrams from his book, looking at with the sun at the centre and with all the planets of the solar system going round, or all the planets that were known at the time. But then along comes the use of the telescope. And now many people think that Galileo invented the telescope. He didn't. But he was one of the first people to use a telescope and turn it up at the night sky and observe what could be seen out there. And Galileo looked at the rings of Saturn. He was able to look and see some of the moons of Jupiter. And he realized they were moons because he looked over a number of months and realized that they were moving around the planet Jupiter. And actually, this is an artist's impression of Galileo and his telescope. This is not what his telescope looked like. His telescope is actually still stored in a museum in Italy. And yes, no, this is not his. Definitely an artist's impression. But yes, so Galileo was one of the first people to use it and to actually get a better understanding of the night sky. And by doing this, suddenly we were able to see things that were far away in much more detail. We were able to log and catalogue things. And that's what people started doing. They started actually people were taking data in before, but just with the naked eye. But with a telescope, they could get a lot more information. And so then it comes along two characters called Tycho Brahe and Kepler. And these are an image of the two of them. And one of the things I like about space and astronomy is talking about the people who've made the discoveries, but talking a bit about the character behind the discovery. And this is a picture of Tycho Brahe and Kepler. And I don't know if you can notice, but on Tycho Brahe, if I highlight here, on Tycho Brahe, if you look closely at his nose, it's a bit discoloured. Now, his nose is a bit discoloured because Tycho Brahe was a bit of a lad, I'm afraid to say. And he used to get in, I won't say fisty fights, but he used to get in sword fights. And in one of these sword fights, someone chopped off his nose. Now, it was okay because Tycho Brahe was quite a rich man, and so he had a nose fashioned in silver as a replacement nose. And so if you're going to have your nose chopped off, I think having a silver nose is probably the way to go. And so, yes, but what Tycho Brahe also did is he did incredibly detailed calculations looking at the night sky and mapping things as they moved across the night sky. And later on, Kepler came along and he took those calculations and he came up with a new view of the universe, the elliptical universe. And so when I showed you Kepler's diagram, it showed the sun at the centre and nice circular orbits of the planets around the sun. But what Kepler and Tycho realised is that those orbits weren't circular; they're actually elliptical, which is like a squish circle. And with that ellipse, there's two foci, and the sun sits at one of the foci, and the planets go round in ellipses. Now, this was quite controversial at the time because the circle was seen to be a thing of God, and what is this squash circle called an ellipse? But the calculations seemed to demonstrate that this was true. But then along comes Isaac Newton, and he came up with the laws of gravity. And Isaac Newton was quite a character. He was a game changer in the story of our understanding of the solar system. And he did this in so many different ways. And I feel I've recently been very privileged because I was working with the National Trust and actually got an opportunity to go to Isaac Newton's childhood home. And I'm actually sitting on Isaac Newton's bed. I don't know why it's not made up. I didn't ask questions. And also, there's rather prominent use of a potty underneath the bed as well. But yes, I wasn't asking questions. But yes, Isaac Newton transformed the way we see the universe. And he did that in a number of different ways. Firstly, if you can see actually in the diagram, I'm just going to point here, there we have a spectrum. Now, as a space scientist, one of the things I've been doing is I've been making spectrums in the lab, and I'll talk about that later. But Isaac Newton was one of the first people to realise that light, or white light, from the sun, for instance, is made up of component colours. It is actually a rainbow. And I was actually able to see the shutter that he used. He poked a hole in one of his shutters. His mum probably wasn't very pleased, but he poked a hole in one of the shutters, got a shaft of sunlight coming into his bedroom, used a prism to split the light into its component colours, and then he used another prism to recombine that light to show that it was white light again. So yes, he was understanding the very nature of light, and that's one of the fundamental things we use to understand the universe today. On top of that, Isaac Newton transformed the telescope. If you saw the picture of Galileo's telescope, it was sort of a telescope, with lenses and things like that. The problem is, with lenses in those days, the glass wasn't very good. So as the light passed through the glass, the light would get sort of the inclusions and air bubbles and things like that would disrupt the image. And so Isaac Newton came out with a new way of making a telescope. You use glass, but instead of using sort of glass as a transmitter, you use it as a reflector. So he came up with the Newtonian telescope, and it's variations of that telescope that we use for the James Webb Space Telescope and everything else that's out there. But also, of course, Isaac Newton came up with the whole idea of gravity. Now, when I speak to some of the younger kids, sometimes a hand goes up and says, excuse me, but did Sir Isaac Newton sort of invent gravity? And I love this idea. It's got to be a TikTok video, because I love this idea of, so everybody floating around, because, gravity hasn't been invented yet, so you're just floating around, having a pretty cool time. Then Isaac Newton's sitting there saying, hey, gravity, and everybody, bam, and falls to the ground. Newton, what have you done? So I love this idea. So Isaac Newton came up with the theory of gravity. And the theory of gravity has been long-standing. It's one of the tenets of science. We believe that the gravitational force is uniform throughout the universe. But I'll talk a bit more about that later. One of the lovely things about going to Sir Isaac Newton's childhood home was I found out a lot about Sir Isaac Newton and him as a child. And so again, it's looking at the character behind the great invention. And so yes, this is him as a child with his little dog. And he was born in Lincolnshire, and he never met his father because unfortunately his father died before he was born. And yes, one of the things I found fascinating was that when Isaac Newton was a child, he wasn't considered very bright at school. So this is a guy who is game-changing in virtually everything he's done. And imagine his mum, Isaac, he's not very bright, is he? I don't know what he's going to do. But he went on to do great things. And one of the things, I think one of the reasons, and there was letters that his mother wrote, and one of the reasons his mother despaired about him is because she wanted him to be a farmer. But whenever he was meant to be looking after the sheep and things like that, he had literally his head in the clouds, and so the sheep would be escaping. Isaac, what are you doing? Oh, damn, the sheep. But one of the things that was quite magical for me is I actually got to sit under the tree where Isaac Newton made his great discovery, he postulated his great theory. And at home, I've actually got a slice of the tree, the apple tree there, Sir Isaac Newton was sitting when he came up with his idea. And yet, his mother wanted him to become a farmer, but he went on to become a scientist. Now, one of the things that I found that when I was speaking about Sir Isaac Newton was that we had a few things in common. Not many, but just a few things in common. So looking at my childhood, I was actually born in London and not in Lincolnshire. But my parents split up when I was 4 years old, and that had quite an effect on me. But when I was at school, I was definitely not considered to be very bright. In fact, I was at the back of the class, with the safety scissors and the glue, and I'll explain why that was later. And growing up, my father, who came from Nigeria, and when he came from Nigeria, he wanted to study medicine here in the UK, but he didn't get the opportunity. And so when I came along, he thought, no, she's quite scientific, she should study medicine. So my father wanted me to be a medical doctor, and my mother wanted me to be an actress. But just like Sir Isaac Newton, I became a scientist. But when I look back at that time, it's quite interesting because this is a picture of me when I'm about 4 years old. And I would have loved to have a picture of me, looking epically into the night sky, contemplating the universe. But no, I've got my ice lolly on the ground. And I'm trying to pick it up before my parents catch me. So not the most glamorous start. But when I was growing up, I thought that astronomy and all subjects like that, when I look back in time, I thought that it was all done by white guys in togas. Because that's all I heard about. You hear about the Greeks, you hear about the Romans. When you hear about the constellations, they're named after Greek and Roman figures. And so I thought, sometimes it seemed a bit strange that a girl like me, a black kid from from inner city London, was interested in astronomy. But since then, I've heard about something called archaeoastronomy. Now, archaeoastronomy is looking back in time, and it's that realization that every culture across the world has looked up at the night sky and wondered. And this is just part of the timeline. This is going back, I think it's maybe sort of 9,000 years in time. And it shows that Africa, Europe, sort of Asia, every culture has built monuments, just try to understand what's going out there. Sometimes it was trying to predict the future, but everybody has tried to look up. And I always have this image in my mind of sort of cave people, ancient people, sort of not even be able to speak in words, just grunting at each other, but by a campfire at night and with a beautiful clear sky, sort of looking up, ugh. Ugh, ugh. I don't think they would have done the thumbs up, but you know what I mean. But yes, there's something. And so when we get out and see a clear night and we can see the cosmos around us, I think we can experience that too, that magic, that wonder. And it's tracing back to our ancestors throughout time. And through my work, I get to work with some amazing people. And a few years ago, I was doing some work with the English heritage. Now, English heritage are the people who they have many sort of monuments they keep, but they are the keepers of Stonehenge. And I actually met the woman who is the keeper of the stones of Stonehenge. And because I was doing this project and it was looking at the night sky above Stonehenge, I was able to actually sort of film there. And actually, at one point they said, would you like to stand in Stonehenge on your own? I said, Yes, I so would like to do that. It's a magical place anyway, and to be there on my own. And so they said, okay, we're finished filming for the day. Let's all withdraw, and you can stay here on your own. And so I was there amongst the stones, so just taking it all in. It was a fantastic moment. But then also, about 2 weeks later, we went back to Stonehenge as a family. So my husband and my daughter, we went back to Stonehenge for the summer solstice. And I was there at Stonehenge with 10,000 other people. And it's funny because I was there with Susan, the keeper of the stones, and people were sort of leaning on the stones. She's just going, I'm just not going to look. And so it was quite stressful for her. But again, to be there, for that dawn on the sort of longest day of the year and see the sunrise between the sort of the stones, it was amazing. But one of the reasons that I mention this now is because Stonehenge is about 5,000 years old. And many people think that this is the oldest stone circle in the world, but it's not. The oldest stone circle in the world that we've found so far is actually called Nabda Playa. It sits on African soil, and it's over 9,000 years old. And so, yes, every culture has looked up at the night sky and wondered. And if you look at the Arabic culture, they made these wonderful instruments called astrolabes. Now, astrolabes are a way of actually, again, tracing the movement of stars and planets and other things across the night sky. And with an astrolabe, you can do that with great accuracy. So this is a wonderful piece of scientific equipment. But it's also a piece of art as well. I call it STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and maths, all rolled in together. Because if you look at these engravings, they are sort of beauty and they sort of tell of sort of other tales. And there's more on top of that. Because if you look at the rim, there are words written in Arabic and they are words from the Quran. So this is a celebration of culture, but a very, very diverse culture, all in one instrument. If you go and look in sort of the South American regions, they built pyramids often aligned to the summer and winter solstice. And a few years ago, we made a trip to Machu Picchu. And there they were saying, yes, astronomers were held in high esteem. And I was saying, those days have gone. But yes, it's just a celebration of everything out there. And so how did this sort of crazy black kid in London sort of get fascinated by space? Well, for me, I had some amazing icons. I heard about Yuri Gagarin, the first person to get out there into space, and look at the universe beyond, and sort of look at the curvature of the Earth. And then, of course, Neil Armstrong, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Those are the words he uttered as he stepped out onto the moon's surface. And so growing up, I heard about these people. I heard about what they'd achieved. And I thought, yes, then and there, I want to get out into space. And it's quite interesting because for me, that is my goal, that is my star. I have always wanted to get out there into space. And I can't remember a time that I haven't wanted to get out into space. In fact, the only time I was slightly wobbling on the whole concept was when my daughter was born. Because I thought, I better hang around Earth and make sure she's okay first. But then, and so now she's 14, it's almost back on track now. But it turns out it wasn't just space that fascinated me. Was also, yes, this does get a little embarrassing. And yet, look, I have to have, I bring a clanger everywhere I go. These are sort of cartoon creatures called the clangers. And as a child, I fell in love with the clangers. And I fell in love with the clangers because they are just like this, little knitted creatures that live out in space. And they don't talk like you and me. They speak in whistles, And that was a really bad whistle. But anyway, they speak in whistles, and although they're whistling, we know exactly what they're saying. And so as a child, they just melted my heart. And I decided, yes, I want to go and visit the clangers. But I must warn you, it turns out that the clangers are a bit of a hardcore drug. You start with the clangers, and before you know it, hardcore science fiction. Yes, I became a Trekkie. Live long and prosper. No, it's quite interesting because science fiction, I once gave a talk called How Science Fiction Saved My Life. Because I've always been fascinated by science fiction. And Star Trek represented something that was very important to me. Because growing up in the 1960s or in the 1970s, I didn't really feel that I belonged anywhere. I would sort of go to school and people would say, why don't you go back home? And I think, I only live around the corner. Oh, you mean Africa? Oh, I see. But the thing is, and so I felt I didn't really want to call myself British because I didn't really feel I belonged. And then I'd go home and I'd meet my relatives and they'd say, Maggie, you're a lost Nigerian. You don't speak the language. You've never been there. You don't really belong to Nigeria. And so I felt I didn't really belong anywhere. And I think that's one of the appeals of space to me as well. From space, you don't see barriers, you don't see borders, you don't see any of those divisions. You just see our glorious planet. And that's what Star Trek represented as well. From space, with Star Trek, it was people from all over our planet, all working together, collaborating, and Spock as well, an alien. And then on top of that, there was Lieutenant Uhura. Oh, Lieutenant Uhura. I mean, wow. She was my role model growing up. She was the communications officer. Captain, I have the Klingons coming through. Whoa! I so wanted to meet Lieutenant Uhura. I wanted to be Lieutenant Uhura. And so these were sort of my role models growing up. And I think this is what enhanced the space bug for me. And in fact, I can remember sort of a time when I was probably about 6 or 7 years old, and I was sort of thinking that these were my crazy dreams. I wanted to go out into space, just as Yuri Gagarin had done, and see the curvature of our planet, and see the glorious planet below. Then what I wanted to do next is I wanted to travel out to the moon's surface and walk next to the footsteps of Neil Armstrong. And then I wanted to go out into space, and wherever they were, I wanted to meet the clangers. I was only 7. I wanted to get out there, and I wanted to meet the clangers. But then finally, what I really wanted to do is I wanted to go on trips, just like they do on Star Trek, what we call now exoplanets. So for each star we see in the night sky, that is a sun like our sun, with planets going around them. And that's the adventures that Star Trek used to go on. They used to go out to these planets and have adventures and meet the aliens. These were my crazy dreams when I was sort of 6 or 7 years old. But my crazy dreams sort of came crashing down when I went to school. Because school for me was quite a tough gig. And it was tough for a number of different reasons. The first thing is I went to 13 different schools when I was growing up. Now, 13 different schools, it means it's more than one a year. So I was going at a fair pace here. And sometimes when I say this and I go out to school kids and I tell them I went to 13 different schools, some kids look at me and say, how naughty were you? It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. As far as I know, I wasn't expelled from any schools. The challenge was that my parents split up when I was 4, as I said. And so sometimes I was with my mum, sometimes I was with my dad. Some schools just closed. I didn't touch them. I don't know what happened. But some schools just closed as well. And so it meant that my education was sort of quite chopped up. But then also the other challenge I faced was, and something that I don't see as a challenge anymore. Actually, when that clip I showed of my daughter and I sort of giving a lecture here, that was probably about 12 years ago. And when I gave that lecture, I used to say, I suffer from dyslexia. But I don't feel that I suffer from dyslexia anymore because I can see many benefits of being dyslexic. And now dyslexia means that you'll probably spot some spelling mistakes on my slides. And my worst nightmare is reading from an auto cue where there's words scanning in front of me and I've got to read them out loud. Ugh, it's just terrifying. But recently I've been made an ambassador for a charity called Made by Dyslexia. And Made by Dyslexia is giving a different viewpoint to dyslexia. And so Made by Dyslexia shows the strengths of dyslexic thinking. Because dyslexics, we have challenges like sort of reading and things like that. And those are all the things you do when you first get to school, which is why I found school very hard. But as a dyslexic, I have visualization, I have imagination, I have storytelling, I love exploring, I'm curious. All these are dyslexic traits. And it's funny, these dyslexic traits are what we need for the future. Because as AI is coming in, AI is doing the grunt work, the medial work, the boring stuff. And it's these sort of skills that we need for the next generation of people. And so as a result, and being an ambassador for Made by Dyslexia, it turns out that Richard Branson is also dyslexic and also an ambassador for Made by Dyslexia. And this is us actually in New York about a month ago. And we were actually sort of celebrating the launch of a new university called the University of Dyslexic Thinking. Now, the University of Dyslexic Thinking isn't actually for dyslexics, it's for everybody else. Now, the University of Dyslexic Thinking is actually celebrating the way that dyslexics think. So dyslexics are often sort of entrepreneurial. As I said, they're curious, they're storytellers, they're great communicators. And so it's trying to teach those skills to everybody else, because those are the skills we need for the future. So if there are any dyslexics in the audience, know that it is your superpower and it will take you far. And it turns out that Isaac Newton was dyslexic as well. And not just Isaac Newton, many of the game changers in science who have changed the way we understand the universe have been dyslexics too. So Isaac Newton, Galileo, Leonardo da Vinci, the Wright brothers, Albert Einstein, and also Stephen Hawking, many of these purported to have this dyslexic thinking. And so I think that's one of the things that dyslexics do. They don't just think out of the world, they think off the planet and beyond. And so that's one of the things we need in the future. Now, through my journey, I've learned many different things along the way. And one of the things I've definitely learned is that in times of change and uncertainty, look for opportunities. Now, one of the opportunities came for me because I mentioned that I went to 13 different schools. Well, I went to 13 different schools, and when I got to my 13th school, they said, what stream should you be in? Upper stream, middle stream, lower stream? We haven't got your notes from previous schools, so where should you be? And I thought about this, and I thought, if I want to be a space scientist, if I want to get out there, I'm going to have to go up my game. So I said, well, I think I should be in the top stream. Yeah, put me in the top stream. And they did. They put me in the top stream, and I didn't watch TV for 2 years because this was my opportunity. And that's when Dallas was on. So yes, and so having a crazy dream really helps you to find those opportunities, and it really allows you to sort of drive yourself on. And so yes, from that, and with lots and lots and lots of help from my mother, my father, teachers that went above and beyond, I was able to get sort of a 10 GCSEs, then go on to do 4 A-levels in physics, chemistry, biology and maths, and then go on to get a degree in physics and a PhD, both from Imperial College. As a child, I would have never thought this is possible. But when you have a crazy dream, it drives you on to literally reach for the stars. And so from that, I've had a very, very varied career. I've got to do all sorts of things, many, many things that I love. And I think I'm quite lucky in some ways because I've been able to steer my career. Over the years, I've got to better know my strengths and weaknesses. If you want me to, if you're doing the book signing later, I always ask people to write their names down because I'm not going to spell them correctly otherwise. So knowing your strengths and weaknesses means that you can steer your way into things that you really love doing and things you're good at. And a few years ago, my husband actually showed me this diagram. And this diagram is called Ikigai. I'm sorry, I'm probably pronouncing it totally incorrectly, but I pronounce it as Ikigai. And it is the Japanese art of life fulfillment. And if you want to sort of actually try and achieve Ikigai, it's sort of looking at this Venn diagram with these 4 circles. What you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can get paid for. And if you can actually sort of merge all of those 4 together, you can work actually towards the centre and actually achieve Ikigai. And so I think it was a few months ago, I was at my daughter's school and we were doing something called career speed dating. Now, career speed dating is quite intense because I was seeing 180 pupils in a day, and I see each pupil for 3 minutes. Now, when you see a pupil for 3 minutes, what can you say? And so at first I was thinking, what do you want to do? And but I was thinking, no, Ikigai, this is what you need to aim for. What you love, what you can get paid for, what you're good at, and what the world needs. Aim for that, and you won't go wrong. So I think Ikigai is a message for everybody. And I think it is, because if you do what you love, I think then you're never working a day in your life. And I feel very privileged to do what I love. One of the other things I've learned, and I think this is important for everyone too, and it's about thinking big and thinking crazy. We all need to do this. Growing up as a child, people used to sort of see me at the back of the class with the safety scissors. And I'd say, I said to 1 or 2 people, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be a space scientist. And they'd say, oh, Maggie, maybe that's a bit hard for you. Why don't you go into nursing? You know, that's scientific. That nursing is a great career, but it's not what made my heart sing. And so, when I go out to kids, I won't say, yeah, have big, crazy dreams and see where they take you. I may never get out into space, but just by having that crazy dream, it's given me the opportunity to do things I would have never thought possible. But we're not just doing it in personal lives, it's also in space and astronomy as well. When I was at university, sort of 20-odd years ago, the largest telescope in the world was one like this. This is the William Herschel telescope, and it sits in La Palma in the Canary Islands. And it's a 4.2-metre telescope. And then, it was one of the largest telescopes in the world. And at that time, we couldn't have telescopes any bigger than this because of this. This is atmospheric disturbance. Now, when you look up at the night sky and you see the stars, often you might see stars twinkling. And if you see stars low on the horizon, they twinkle more than stars up at the zenith. And stars twinkle not because that's an inherent property of the stars. They twinkle because of a turbulence in the atmosphere. So pockets of hot gas cause this turbulence, and it causes the stars to twinkle. Now, twinkling stars seems really romantic and it's a lovely thing to happen, but for astronomers, it's a right pain. Because what we want is we want a good, solid image of the star, and that's not what we get. And so in the past, telescopes couldn't be much more than about 4.2 meters, because otherwise you've got many different sort of weather cells, and you'd get too much twinkling. But then came something called adaptive optics. Now, adaptive optics, it actually looks at an object in the night sky. It might be a sort of a laser point of light. It might be actually a star. And what it does is it monitors that star. And it works out how that star is twinkling, how it is responding to the atmosphere. And then what you can do is you can actually take that response and feed it back into the telescope and actually de-twinkle the stars. You distort a mirror to take out the twinkle. And so when you do this with adaptive optics, suddenly we've got much, much bigger telescopes. And so this is a sort of an image comparison. You start off with something like the first one, sort of moving all over the place, and you end up with that nice, steady point of light, which you can analyse in detail. So with this, you could actually de-twinkle the stars. And so now we're building bigger and better telescopes. I spent a number of years working on the Gemini telescope in South America, but this is a group of telescopes called the VLT. And that stands for Very Large Telescopes. Oh yeah, we're talking big boys. We're talking 4 8-meter telescopes, and sometimes they can be combined. And so the light from each one of these telescopes can be combined using these sort of white trains. We can combine the light together, so it's like we have a ginormous telescope. Now, when you have a bigger telescope, when you have a bigger telescope gathering more light, you can see fainter objects. But what you can also do is you can get better resolution. And what resolution means is if you've got 2 objects which are quite close together in space, or at least seem spatially close together, what you can do is you can actually resolve them as 2 separate objects, and it gives you so much more detail. So a bigger telescope means more detail. So when we talk about the James Webb Space Telescope being the largest space telescope ever launched, it means we're getting more detail in what we see. But now the VLT is getting quite old. It's 25 years old. And so now we're looking for the next generation of telescope. And these are ground-based optical telescopes. And so now we are actually building a new telescope called the ELT. And that stands for the Extremely Large Telescope. I am not making this up. The Extremely Large Telescope is a telescope where the primary mirror is 39 meters in diameter. And we went out about 18 months ago to see the ELT being built. Now, I've been doing sort of science communication for about 20 years, and I'm also talking about the ELT in the future. But to see it being built, and it's the size of a football stadium, it is glorious. And yes, it doesn't actually sit next to Big Ben, but it is as tall as Big Ben. It is a fantastic thing to see. And so, yeah, I've been speaking for about 20 years about the ELT, and for an equal amount of time, I've been speaking about a telescope we call the OWL, and that stands for the Overwhelmingly Large Telescope. Okay, this telescope I may never see, but this telescope has a primary mirror, so the light-gathering power of the telescope is 100 meters in diameter. We're talking about a telescope where the main mirror is the size of a football pitch. And so, yes, we are thinking big and thinking crazy. But one question to ask is, if we have adaptive optics and we can do all this glorious astronomy from right here on the ground now, why are we putting telescopes into space? Space telescopes are incredibly expensive. This is a can of water. It's about 1/3 of a litre of water. Getting 1/3 of a litre of water into space costs probably about £10,000. So why are we putting things into space? Well, it's all to do with what we call the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, the electromagnetic spectrum is what is generated in the heart of stars. Due to a fusion process, elements or atoms are fused together, they release energy, and that energy is released as part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, the electromagnetic spectrum covers a whole wealth of things. So, for instance, I'm standing here in front of you, there are bright lights shining on me, that light is reflecting off me and going into your eyes, so that's why you can see me. So that's a visible light, that's part of the electromagnetic spectrum. But we have radio waves, we have sort of infrared, and the other waves, we've got the high energy stuff, gamma rays, X-rays. All of these things, these electromagnetic waves can pass through the vacuum of space. Other things can't pass through the vacuum of space. I was watching one of the Alien films. It was on Film 4 last night. And one of the taglines for Alien when it first came out is, in space, no one can hear you scream. And it sounded really eerie, but it's also true. You're hearing me because I'm speaking to a microphone that's coming out of speakers, and it's sound waves, compression waves in the air. If I go out into space, well, if I didn't have a spacesuit on, I wouldn't last very long anyway. But sound waves won't travel through the vacuum of space because there's nothing to carry the vibration. But electromagnetic waves can travel through the vacuum of space. And so, yes, visible light is one of the things we pick up from space. This is one of the ways we can interrogate space and understand space. But the problem is, our atmosphere blocks out some of that electromagnetic spectrum. In fact, there's only two windows, one in the radio and one is in the optical, a bit in the infrared, where we can actually get those signals from space. Everything else is opaque. And so those wavelengths, those that are generated by stars and other things out there, they can't actually penetrate the Earth's atmosphere, so we can't pick them up down here on the ground. And that's really good news, because gamma rays and X-rays, they are really dangerous. And when we send people out into space, we need to protect them from that. And that's one of the reasons that astronauts wear those big, bulky suits. They need those suits as a sort of a whole life support system. But one of the things they're also doing is they're protecting them from that radiation. And so, yes, so now if we want to actually pick up those different wavelengths of light, we need to send things up into space. And so that's just what we do. This is the European Space Agency's fleet. This is actually getting quite old. But it's a fleet of different different missions looking at different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. So we're looking at the X-rays, the gamma rays. We've got the James Webb Space Telescope, which is actually an infrared telescope. We've got Hubble, which is actually a visible light telescope, but it sits up in space, so it gets out of the atmosphere and gets better images. But we have a wide range of different telescopes looking at different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And as I say, the James Webb Space Telescope is an infrared telescope. And this is actually a sort of a real-life model that went touring across the world. And I'm not actually in this picture, but James Webb Space Telescope was built by 10,000 scientists across the world. 10,000 scientists from 16 different countries, all collaborating to work on this glorious instrument, this probe to understand space more. And if we compare sort of the James Webb with Hubble, Hubble was mainly working in in visible light, but the James Webb Space Telescope was designed to look in infrared. So the James Webb was almost the next generation of space telescope. What we learned from Hubble, we learned an awful lot from Hubble, but it also threw up a lot of questions. And what the James Webb was designed for was to try and answer some of those questions. And so, yes, the fact sheet of James Webb, it's a huge telescope, weighs about 6 tons, which is incredibly expensive to get into space. The mirror was 6.5 meters in diameter. Now, this is an infrared telescope, so infrared light actually has longer wavelength, so we need to scale that a bit. But yes, a 6.5 meter mirror, which is quite hard to get into space when you actually have to put it on board a rocket and get it out there. It was actually launched on Christmas Day in 2021. And I must admit, it was a wonderful day because my daughter was opening Christmas presents and it was a lovely day. But I was sitting there nervously. Will it go up? Will it work? I was quite taken by it. But also it sits in a very different position. The Hubble Space Telescope sits in low Earth orbit, so about 400 kilometers above sea level. The James Webb Space Telescope sits in deep, dark space at 1.5 million kilometers away from planet Earth. And so that's one of the challenges with the James Webb Space Telescope. If anything goes wrong, there is no going back. We can't go out and fix it. I don't know if many people are familiar with Hubble trouble. When Hubble was first launched, it was incredibly embarrassing. I wasn't involved, but it was incredibly embarrassing because the mirror was actually manufactured to the wrong specification. And so when we first got images back from the Hubble Space Telescope, they were blurry and horrible, and we built this space telescope to give us glorious images of space. And what we actually had to do was use the space shuttle, and astronauts had to go and make a pair of glasses to fit onto the Hubble Space Telescope so we can get the glorious images we have. But Hubble is still out there, 30 years on, still getting glorious images. But with the James Webb Space Telescope, it sits at a very particular point in space called Lagrange point 2. And I've got a little video to explain where that is.
As we all know, the Earth goes around the Sun in what is pretty close to a circular orbit. But around this orbit, there are some very interesting locations. They're called Lagrange points. Lagrange points occur because of the way the forces of gravity and orbiting bodies interact. Anything that finds itself in one of these locations will stay there in a fixed position relative to the Earth as they all go around the Sun. Let's start with Lagrange point 1. That sits in here, about 1.5 million kilometers away from the Earth. Now this is the ideal position for a solar observatory because it has an uninterrupted view of the Sun as the Earth orbits the Sun. Next, we have Lagrange point 4 and Lagrange point 5. They sit at an angle of 60 degrees ahead of the Earth and behind the Earth. Despite being millions of kilometers away from the Sun and Earth, objects here will stay in a fixed position relative to the Earth as it orbits the Sun. Next, we have L3 that sits all the way over here on the other side of the Sun. It is permanently out of view of the Earth and a long, long way away from the Earth, so we don't do much out here. But that brings me to L2. This point sits 1.5 million kilometers away from the Earth, and it has unobscured views of deep, dark space. It's unobscured by the Earth, it's unobscured by the Sun, and any of the inner planets.
So that's where we put the James Webb Space Telescope at Lagrange point 2. It's like a gravitational well. So it sits there and it doesn't need any propulsion to keep it sort of moving around the Sun as the Earth goes around the Sun. And it adds this beautiful, unobscured view of deep, dark space. And so this is the James Webb Space Telescope. To get it up into space, we had to fold it up like origami so it could actually fit on board a spacecraft and then be launched into space. And then when it was launched into space, as it moved further and further away, we started deploying various units, the solar panels. This is actually what we call the heat shield. Because we have infrared light coming from the Sun and the Earth, we want to protect the James Webb Space Telescope from that, because otherwise any of those signals would overwhelm anything it's looking at in deep, dark space. And so when it was launched, there were 300 separate actuations, separate mechanisms that needed to be deployed before the James Webb Space Telescope could actually start working. And so as the days went on, we were sitting there as space scientists, engineers, technocrats, all waiting for each one of these things to be deployed and make sure it worked. Fortunately, everything went fine, but it was quite a nerve-wracking time. And yeah, this is the sort of a 6.5 meter mirror, which was folded up on itself and had to be sort of deployed when it actually got out into space. And so yes, a lot that needed to happen, but it's all happening, and now it's bringing back the amazing images that we're seeing. Okay, so what is James Webb Space Telescope actually designed to do? Well, as I said, the Hubble Space Telescope went up over 30 years ago. It started looking at the universe, and it started transforming our knowledge of the universe. It started giving us many clues to questions that we'd asked in the past. But what it also did is it threw up many questions. And it was soon worked out that to answer some of these questions, if we had an infrared telescope, we might be able to get some answers. Because infrared light is a different wavelength from visible light. And there are some parts of the universe which are obscured by dust and gas, for instance, within our galaxy. Now, visible light can't penetrate through this dust and gas, but infrared light can. And so if we have an infrared telescope, we can peer behind some of this dust and gas and understand what's happening out there. And so in terms of scientific goals, it was searching for the first light from the first stars and galaxies of the universe. Telescopes are time machines. I always like to make a suggestion that never look at the sun because it can seriously damage your eyes. But if the sun winked out of existence, we wouldn't know for about 8 minutes because it takes 8 minutes from the light to come from the sun and to hit the Earth. And so now, when we're looking at some of these faraway objects, they are objects that were, the light left them at the time of the early universe, so maybe 12 billion years ago. And it's taken 12 billion years for that light to reach us. And so with the James Webb Space Telescope, we are looking back in time. Also, because of the expansion of the universe, visible light is expanded into infrared light. So we can really see even earlier, back in time to the early universe. And so that's what we're looking at, the first stars, the first galaxies, and what happened at this time, soon after the Big Bang. We're also studying galaxy formation and evolution. We're looking at sort of planets. I mentioned exoplanets earlier. Are there exoplanets out there? How do planets form? It gives us many more examples of what's going on out there. And then you have planetary systems. We have our solar system, but what other planetary systems are there? And so, yes, this is a lovely comparison because it shows a visible view of a nebula and also the infrared view. And as you can see, we can peer through some of the clouds of dust, and it gives us a different viewpoint. And this is one of the most important things. It is what I like to call tripping the light fantastic. I've worked on visible telescopes, I've worked on infrared, I've worked on UV telescopes. It is using this sort of wide range of the electromagnetic spectrum to study the universe. I always like to compare it to a picture by Van Gogh. If you look at it in the blues, then the yellows, and then the greens, it's not until you combine all those colours together that you get the complete picture. And it's exactly the same when you look out into the universe. Even looking at our local star, this is our local star, the Sun, taken with something called a H-alpha filter, which is a very, very narrow band of visible light filter. But if you look at it in sort of UV, infrared, X-rays, sort of gamma rays, it's not until you get all those different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum together that you get a complete picture of what's happening on our local star. And so this is what we're doing. We're using the James Webb Space Telescope to fill in some of the gaps that we don't get elsewhere. But the James Webb Space Telescope is also chock-a-block with some fantastic technology. One of the game-changing pieces of technology is something called the micro-shutter array. This is an array of tiny, tiny little windows, each one controlled and actuated, so you can have the window open or closed. And there's about I think about 2,000 of these little windows, which all go together to make the micro-shutter array. That means that when we actually see a star field, rather than analysing, usually you might have a bright star, but you might want to look at that dim feature over there. Using the micro-shutter array, we can block out the bright light. We can actually obscure that and look at the dim features by opening the appropriate window. And not only that, we can take that light and then send it through what we call a spectrometer and stretch that light, just as Newton did, into its component colours and analyse what's happening in that object, sometimes trillions of light years away. And so we can actually understand the universe in a way that we've never done before. But as well as looking at some of the early universe, James Webb is also able to look at the outer planets of the solar system. Sitting out there at Lagrange point 2, it means it has unobscured views of space, but it also sees the outer planets of the solar system. And this is the planet Uranus. Uranus. I always get that wrong. Upbringing, it's hard to get it out. But anyway, and so yes, this is a Uranus. And many people don't realise that all the planets of the outer solar system have rings too. So Jupiter, Saturn that we know about, but Neptune and Uranus also have rings. And this is an infrared image of the planet Uranus showing its glorious rings. But also it's a planet that actually goes round the sun on its side. All the other planets of the solar system orbit the sun and sort of spin on their axis, but for some reason Uranus is on its side and it's actually going around the sun this way. And what we're trying to do is work out why that happened. Was there a cataclysmic collision that actually knocked it on its side? But another thing we can do is we can get data cubes with the James Webb Space Telescope. So we can look at the James Webb Space Telescope using spectroscopy, so actually analysing sort of the chemical composition, but we can also get data cubes by using different filters and getting an understanding of what's happening in large objects and getting the detail of those as well. But I was going to talk about some of the images taken by the James Webb Space Telescope. This is an image which I think many people are familiar with because it's an image called the Pillars of Creation. And it was first taken in the 1920s, actually, I think in 1920, by this chap, John C. Duncan. And this was using photographic plate, so a black and white image, and it was taken by the Mount Wilson Telescope in LA, one of the largest telescopes available at the time. And this is the image he took of what we call the Pillars of Creation. And then Hubble came along and it took an updated pictures of the pillars of creation. And this is what we saw. These large jutting clouds of dust and gas, they're protruding into space. And we know these to be stellar nurseries. This is the places where new and baby stars are born. But now with the James Webb Space Telescope, we've got a new vision. And this vision is not just an infrared vision, but it's also a vision that gives us much more detail because we're out there in space above the Earth's atmosphere. And also we have a large telescope mirror, and so we get the detail. And now what we're able to do is things like this. Look at it in detail.
By the Hubble Space Telescope using visible light, the pillars are equally amazing in the infrared view of the Webb Space Telescope. Examining their structure in 3 dimensions, they separate into individual clouds. The right pillar is closest and is backlit by the star's intense radiation. Glowing ionized gas streams away from the pillars. The infrared view of the central pillar reveals vibrant evidence of an embedded protostar. The top of the left pillar is directly bombarded by energetic starlight. Dense pockets of dust resist the erosion and create narrow, finger-like peaks. Lower down, jets from a newborn star shoot away from a peak. The semi-transparent body of the pillar lies in the shadow of the dense top. A newborn star blazes at the end of this peak, underscoring the nickname, Pillars of Creation.
And so this gives us a new view. Now remember, we can't go out into space and fly around the pillars of creation. They are hundreds of light years away from us. And yet, when we get the detail with the James Webb Space Telescope, we can sort of interpolate and try and work out what's happening sort of round the corner and get this sort of glorious image of what we imagine is happening in the pillars of creation. And just to talk about each one of those pillars, each one of those protrusions, the top of that is the size of our solar system. So the sun in the middle and the planets going around it. So these are huge stellar nurseries, but we're able to see them in amazing detail because of the James Webb Space Telescope. But other things that the James Webb Space Telescope is doing is it's changing our knowledge of the universe. This is some recent data that was sort of just released, and it shows 3 very early galaxies. So these galaxies are at 12.8 billion years old, because it's taken 12.8 billion years for the light to actually reach the James Webb Space Telescope. And what we're finding is these galaxies are not behaving as we expected. Our theory, and we talk about sort of things like dark energy and dark matter. Dark energy and dark matter are things out there in the universe which we think are there, but we can't see because they don't react to the electromagnetic spectrum. We think they're there because we see how galaxies move. And galaxies and the stars at the edge of the galaxies seem to move faster than anticipated. And so that implies that there's a lot more mass in these galaxies, but mass that we aren't seeing. They're not giving out light. And so suddenly we're thinking, oh, okay, there must be something else in there. And because we can't see it, we call it dark matter. Now, that 94% of the universe seems to be made out of dark matter, although that's the current theory. Although looking at these galaxies, they seem to be much, much bigger far earlier than we anticipated. And so we think that galaxies came together and got big because they collided with each other, and there was a sort of a slow but steady progression of these stars into these big galaxies. But the fact we're seeing these big galaxies so early on means that something else is going on. And then suddenly the whole idea of dark matter is being questioned. Maybe there's something else going on. And maybe what's going on is that gravity, as we know it, isn't as uniform as we first thought. Maybe as you move away from the highly dense gravitational field at the center of galaxies, maybe as you go further out, the gravitational force is weaker. And so that's why these stars are moving faster than we first anticipated. So with the James Webb Space Telescope, as well as sort of answering some things, we are throwing up more questions. evidence. And to me, the idea of sort of dark energy and dark matter has been around for a number of years. But the fact that we're finding data that's questioning that, that's asking us to come up with new theories, as a scientist, I feel really excited. For one thing, it means I'm going to be in a job for a long time. But another thing is, that's the way the scientific method works. We come up with a theory, we find evidence that seems to support the theory, and then more evidence comes along and it doesn't support the theory. So we have to update our theory. We are in that process at the moment, looking at our theories, and theories that have been around for centuries, we are looking at them and seeing if they're true. So that is talking about sort of out there in deep, dark space. But one of the things that I'd like to mention is that as a space scientist, I haven't spent all my career working on sort of just looking at the beyond our Earth. Most of the satellites that I've worked on in the past have actually been Earth observation satellites actually designed to look at our planet and give us a better understanding of our planet. This is a satellite called Aeolus, and it measures wind speed in the Earth's atmosphere by sending pulses of UV light into the atmosphere. That light is reflected off particles. We can pick up that reflected light and work out how those particles are moving under the influence of the wind. And so Aeolus has been up in space for a number of years now, and it is giving us a better understanding of climate change, because it turns out that the wind is what it connects weather cells together. So understanding the wind gives us a better understanding of our climate. Also, there are satellites like FLEX. This is a satellite designed to actually look at how plants are photosynthesizing, but how plants are photosynthesizing from space. So the photosynthetic process takes off carbon dioxide, it takes sunlight, and it combines them with carbon dioxide to actually make sugars. I think that was right. Anyway, and so, but yet when they do this, they take in the sunlight, but then they fluoresce later. We can actually watch how they actually give out that light later, and it gives us an understanding of how well plants are photosynthesizing. It means that we can actually work out in certain areas of the world, okay, these plants aren't doing so well, they're not taking up as much carbon dioxide as we thought. How can we actually make this food production better? What is missing? So it's giving us an understanding of how to feed the world in the future. One of the other satellites I've got to work on is something called the Disaster Monitoring Constellation. This is a group of, a collaboration of countries across the world who each have made one of these satellites that sit in low Earth orbit, just like the Hubble Space Telescope. And using these satellites, whenever there's a disaster, they can actually, as the next one passes over the disaster area, they can take images and send them down to NGOs and government organizations. So you get that global view from space. And so, yes, with these satellites, they're making a difference to the world. And so sometimes people ask, should we be spending all this money on space? Most of the money we spend on space is actually designed to help us on planet Earth. And there's some blue sky stuff looking out there that just helps us understand the universe. That's the philosophical viewpoint. And so through my career, I've got to do all sorts of things. And just a number of things very close to my heart. I was recently admitted to St. Catherine's College as an honorary fellow. And so I'm loving that and sort of being part of the St. Catherine's community. I'm also the chancellor of the University of Leicester. The guy standing in front of me is Mace Man, and he's there for my protection. Unfortunately, I can't take him home with me, but when I'm at Leicester, he follows me around. And I get an opportunity to do things I would have never thought possible. This is a video that happened a number of years ago. But yes, again, reaching for the stars leads to opportunities.
My name is Dr. Maggie Aderin-Pocock, and I'm a space scientist and a science communicator. And I do love to share my passion of science with everyone. So it is a true honour to be speaking with you just now. But one of the reasons I became a space scientist is because of someone I share a birthday with. So it was actually my birthday yesterday on the 9th of March. But Yuri Gagarin, the first human to travel out into space, was also born on the 9th of March. And I believe, ma'am, that you met him. Can you tell us about that?
I did indeed, yes. It was very interesting to meet him.
What was he like?
Russian.
It's not every day you get to do a Zoom call with the Queen of England. But as I say, when you think big and think crazy, anything can happen. One of the other things that I've observed in my time is that together we can do the seemingly impossible. And the seemingly impossible, by its very nature, seems impossible. And one of the things that I found is that when I was a student and learning at university, we used to talk about the stars. We know that each one of those stars in the night sky is a sun like our sun. And we postulated that there may be planets going around those stars. But the problem is, stars are big and bright and give out lots of light, but planets don't give out any light at all. I was speaking to some people yesterday because the skies were quite clear, and saying that if you go outside, soon after sunset, in the next few days, if it's clear, you might see the planet Venus. Now, the planet Venus is a glorious planet to see because it is like twinkle, twinkle, little star, like a diamond in the sky. And you see the planet Venus because light is made in the heart of our local star, the sun, due to a process called fusion. That light takes years and years to get to the surface of the sun, and then it streams out into space. The reason we can see Venus is because that light travels out to Venus, is reflected off of the Venusian atmosphere, and then that light can land in our eyes. To me, that's magic. Light made in the heart of a star lands in our eyes. But that's how we see the planets of the solar system. But the problem is, if we want to see exoplanets, these planets going around the stars, which are trillions of kilometers away, we need to use different techniques. Now, so far, we've found about 6,000 exoplanets out there, and we're finding all sorts of exotic stuff, hot Jupiters, all sorts of amazing planets out there. But the problem is they are very hard to find. Because the planets don't give out light, we have to use other methods. And so this is one of the methods. We call it the wobble method, because as the planet goes around the star will wobble by a small amount because of the gravitational force of the planet. Now, we use this technique for sort of finding larger, more massive planets. But yes, because you can see the star, you can see that wobble. But the main way we find exoplanets out there is by using the transit method, and this is it. As an exoplanet will go in front of the star will dim by a small amount. We can actually see that dimming of the starlight and work out that there's an exoplanet out there. So this is almost the science of impossible, but we've taken it even further. Using spectroscopy, now what we can do is, as an exoplanet goes in front of the star, a tiny, tiny fraction of the starlight will pass through the atmosphere of that exoplanet if it has an atmosphere. And what we can do is, we can actually look at that fraction of starlight, do some spectroscopy, and work out what chemicals are in the atmosphere of an exoplanet trillions of kilometers away from us. And doing this, we are finding Earth-like planets, planets with water vapor in their atmospheres. And so yes, now we are not only finding exoplanets, we're looking at their atmospheres. When I was at university, was the science of the impossible, but it's happening today. Also, we're able to look at water features. This is some James Webb Space Telescope data, looking at that sort of spectroscopic information. And we're finding amazing sort of stars. This is a red giant star, a red dwarf star called TRAPPIST-1. And what we found is 7 exoplanets in orbit about this star. And 4 of them sit in what we call the habitable zone, or the Goldilocks zone. So we think that if they are the right sort of planet, they might have liquid water on their surface. Could those be our homes in the future? And yes, there's all sorts of emission data looking at these atmospheres and giving us an understanding of what's out there. But sometimes it's lovely to look into deep, dark space, but I like to keep on bringing it home. And this is an image called Earthrise. So this was taken by the Apollo 8 mission. And Apollo 8 was one of those missions that didn't actually land on the moon, but they did everything else. They took off from Earth, they went out to the moon, they orbited the moon. And then when they were orbiting the moon, this is what they saw. They saw this glorious picture of our own planet. And when they saw this, I've actually heard the telemetry, and they say, hey, pass me the camera. Take a picture. Make sure it's the colour film. Everybody at home needs to see this, because this image is really seen as a game changer. When people saw this image, they suddenly saw our planet in a different light. We run around our planet, we do things on it. But now, when you see this, you see our planet as small and vulnerable in the darkness of space. And many people think that when this image was taken, I think it was in 1966, that after this came home, many people think that it spawned the environmental movement. Suddenly we realised that we need to look after our planet more. And speaking of the environmental movement, it's quite interesting because I was very honoured to be invited up to COP26 when it happened up in Glasgow. And I went there and I was chairing a meeting which was the heads of the meteorological societies of the world. And so the heads of various meteorological societies came along to this meeting, and we were talking about the challenge of climate change. And it was quite interesting because in the sort of developed world, or in the Western world, we were saying, we're worried about climate change. But then there were people from sort of Kenya and Tibet, and they were saying, we are living with climate change. Climate change are washing away our traditions. The roofs we used to make out of mud are being washed away. That was in Tibet. And so they were saying, you are talking about mitigation against climate change, but we're living with it today. And that's one of the problems about things like climate change. They feel insurmountable. It feels as if we need to get the world together. But every so often we sort of get it close and then it all falls apart. We make sort of promises, yes, we'll do this, and then it all falls apart. And so how do we actually get everybody behind us and get everybody sort of talking from the same hymn sheet? And as the work, coming back from COP26, later on I bumped into this fantastic woman called Cristina Ferregas, and she talks about something called stubborn optimism. So I'll play the video because I'll let her explain it.
Any reality we are given is not set in stone. It can be changed. From my father, I learned stubborn optimism. The mindset that is necessary to transform the reality we're given into the reality we want. The Paris Agreement of 2015 is hailed as a historical breakthrough. But we started in utter gloom. When I assumed leadership of the international climate change negotiations in 2010, 6 months after the failed Copenhagen meetings, the world was in a very dark place on climate change. No one believed we would ever agree on global decarbonization. Not even I believed it was possible. But then I realized a shared vision and a globally agreed route toward that vision was indispensable. It took a deliberate change of mindset, first in me, and then in all other participants, who gradually but courageously moved from despair to determination, from confrontation to collaboration, until we collectively delivered the global agreement. Optimism means envisioning our desired future and then actively pulling it closer. Optimism opens the field of possibility. It drives your desire to contribute, to make a difference. It makes you jump out of bed in the morning because you feel challenged and hopeful at the same time. But it isn't going to be easy. We will stumble along the way. Many other global urgencies could temper our hope for rapid progress. And our current geopolitical reality could easily dampen our optimism. That's where stubbornness comes in. Our optimism cannot be a sunny day attitude. It has to be gritty, determined, relentless. It is a choice we have to make every single day. Every barrier must be an indication to try a different way. In radical collaboration with each other, we can do this. I invite each of you to ask yourself, what is the future you want? And what are you doing to make that future a reality? You will each have a different answer, but you can all start by joining the growing family of stubborn optimists around the world. Welcome to the family.
So when I heard that term, stubborn optimist, it just resonated with me. And I think that's what we all need in our lives, more stubborn optimism. I know I've got the optimism and I've got the stubbornness as well, but it's combining the two that makes it really powerful. And in fact, as a result of that, I've recently been working on a project. I'm also an ambassador for the International Rescue Committee. The International Rescue Committee is a charity that tries to help people in the worst affected areas in the world. And so every year they come up with the watch list, the 10 worst affected areas in the world. And it can be by climate, it can be by sort of war, it can be by all sorts of other things. But it's the 10 worst affected areas. And we're starting up a project recently where we're trying to link people in these worst affected areas with scientists. As a scientist and an engineer, I would love to help people and sort of understand the challenges that they're facing. But the problem is I'm too far removed from what their situation is. And so what we're trying to do is getting people to share their stories, to share the challenges that they're facing in these areas, and share those with scientists, with engineers, with everybody, so that we can find existing solutions or make new solutions to help with these worst affected areas. And so I'm doing this with the International Rescue Committee, and it is, some of that stubborn optimism that I think will enable us to succeed. I really need to wrap up because I've been talking for far too long now. And so, but even the craziest dreams can come true. And I mentioned that, I love the clangers. Well, it turns out that because I said I became a space scientist because of the clangers, they actually made an episode of the clangers with me in it. And so it's available on YouTube, and it's called The Visitor. And this is, my daughter and I went to Altrincham to actually visit the clangers, and where they make the clangers. And at one point, they put the soup dragon in my hand, and I was like, I was crying, and my daughter was like, Mum, it's a puppet. You're so sad. There was a little 7-year-old girl jumping up and down inside me, very excited. Another thing that got to happen is, this is my daughter, Laurie. She's holding a clanger, but this is Lieutenant Uhura. I got to meet the actress Nichelle Nichols. And so this is my favourite picture, because it's my lovely daughter Lauren. She's holding a clanger, and she's sitting next to Lieutenant Uhura. It can't get better than that. But as I say, my crazy dream is reaching for the stars. And it turns out that the next door neighbour star, out of the 300 billion stars in our galaxy, turns out to have an exoplanet going around it. We don't know what it looks like. This is an artist's representation, but we know it's an Earth-sized planet going around a star. So this is what I want to do. I want to go and visit Proxima b. I want to go and visit this exoplanet. And so this exoplanet, it's the nearest star system to us out of the 300 billion in our galaxy. It is 4.28 light years away. So a light year is the distance that light travels in a year. So yeah, it's virtually our next door neighbour. And so that translates to 40 trillion kilometres. Now, to make that journey of 14 trillion kilometres using current technology, that current technology means travelling at 16 kilometres a second. I would love to travel at that speed. That journey of 40 trillion kilometres will actually take... I know. This really is a crazy dream. But when we collaborate and work together, crazy dreams can come true. So this is the late, great Stephen Hawking, and he was championing a new project called Breakthrough Starshot. Breakthrough Starshot is using an existing technology, but in a different way. This is something known as a solar sail. Now, solar sails are a sheet of metallized plastics, and what they have in the past, we've used light from the sun to accelerate the solar sails in space. But what we want to do now is we don't want to use sunlight, we want to use lasers. We want to turn off the power to a major city, have a pulse of laser light shooting up into space, hitting this solar sail and accelerating it. Because as the light, the photons, hit the solar sail, they will transfer their momentum and we'll be able to accelerate this solar sail. In fact, we can accelerate this solar sail to 1/5 of the speed of light. That's warp factor 1/4 for any Trekkies. But anyway, if we are able to do this, then this solar sail will whiz off to our next door neighbour star system. And so there it is. We just need this pulse of light to accelerate it. In space, there is a vacuum, so there's no air resistance. It can continue going. We can't slow it down, though. So as it goes past this exoplanet, we can only take photographs. So what we'll do is we will grab images of this exoplanet and beam them back to Earth. So there it goes, and it takes a number of different photographs, and it will send these photographs back to Earth using radio waves. And so this is the idea. With this, we will actually be able to see up close and personal an exoplanet. So that's the beam of radio waves coming back to Earth. So this is the plan. But there is still a challenge, because as I say, I would love to make this journey, but the size of the probe we can send out there is this. So this is a business card, and the probe we can send out can weigh no more than 1 gram. I had a fine supper earlier. I weigh a lot more than 1 gram. But it does mean that in the near future, we might be able to answer, are we alone in the universe? And so if we actually get this technology to work, that journey of 76,000 years won't take 76,000 years. If we can travel at 1/5 of the speed of light, that journey will take just 20 years. So I say the time is right now. Have a crazy dream, be bold, aim high, and love every second. It's worked for me, it can work for you. Let's all be stubborn optimists. Thank you so much for listening.